It was a warm evening in the city, and the sound of laughter filled the big mansion. Inside, the wealthy guests of Mr. Harold sat around the dining table, their voices echoing through the wide hall. Expensive perfume filled the air, and the faint sound of music played from hidden speakers. Everything looked perfect, polished silver, shining floors, and people dressed in luxury. But in the middle of all that perfection worked Grace, the nanny who always kept her head down. Grace moved quietly through the hall, carrying trays, clearing glasses, and making sure the children upstairs were asleep. She was known for her calm smile and her patience. No matter how people spoke to her, she answered softly. Some of the staff liked her. Others whispered that she was too proud for a maid. The guests barely noticed her. To them, she was just part of the background, someone who blended into the walls of the house. Mr. Harold, the millionaire who owned the mansion, was a man who liked control. Everything about him was polished. His voice, his suits, even the way he laughed. He was proud of his success, proud of the house he built, and proud of his place among the rich. To him, money proved everything. And in his eyes, people like Grace, poor, ordinary, humble, were just workers who existed to serve. As the night went on, the guests talked about art and culture. One woman bragged about her daughter's piano lessons. Another mentioned her son's private violin tutor. The conversation turned to classical music. Someone laughed and said, "It's sad how people today have no sense of real art anymore." That's when Harold's wife, smiling politely, mentioned that Grace sometimes hummed while working. "You should hear her," she said casually. "She always hums those old tunes when she's cleaning or cooking." "Sounds almost musical," the table laughed. Harold raised a brow. "Our nanny hums classical tunes?" he said with a smirk. "That's new. Maybe we've been hiding a musician all along." Grace froze when she heard her name. She was nearby pouring wine for one of the guests. She smiled nervously, unsure if they were joking or serious. One of the men chuckled. "Maybe she can play for us," he teased. Harold's eyes glimmered with amusement. "You know what? That's not a bad idea," he said. "We've got that grand piano sitting there collecting dust." Grace's heart skipped a beat. She looked up and saw Harold's smirk aimed directly at her. "Come on, Grace," he said in a playful but commanding tone. "Why don't you show us what you've got? Play us a tune." The room burst into quiet laughter. A few guests leaned back in their chairs waiting for the show. Grace's hands tightened around the wine bottle. "Sir, I don't think—" "Oh, come now," Harold interrupted. "Don't be shy. You must know something simple. Just a little song for fun. We all could use some entertainment." She felt her face grow warm. She wasn't used to being the center of attention, especially in front of people who didn't take her seriously. The laughter in the room wasn't kind. It was the kind that made her feel small, as if she was being pulled into something cruel. "I'm sorry, sir," she said softly. "I haven't played in a long time." "That means you can play," one guest said loudly, laughing. "You see? She's just being modest." The others joined in, clapping their hands in rhythm like a game. Grace stood there, unsure what to do. The piano sat in the corner of the hall, shining under the lights. It was beautiful, black, tall, and spotless. Her heart ached just looking at it. Years ago, that used to be her dream. Back then, she lived in a small apartment where her late mother taught her to play on an old second-hand piano. They didn't have much, but they had music. Her mother always said, "Music doesn't ask what you look like. It just listens to your heart." Grace had spent hours practicing, her small hands moving carefully across the keys until she could play songs by ear. She grew up playing in community events and small church gatherings. People used to smile and clap when she played. But after her mother passed away and life became harder, she had to give it all up. She needed work, not applause. Music didn't pay bills. Now, standing in that grand hall full of laughter and arrogance, she felt that same ache she once felt when she left her piano behind. Harold's voice broke through her thoughts. "Well, Grace?" he said again, a teasing grin on his face. "We're waiting." The room fell silent for a moment. All eyes were on her. She could feel the children's footsteps upstairs, the faint ticking of the clock, the air heavy with expectation. Slowly, she walked toward the piano. Every step echoed softly on the marble floor. Her hands felt cold and her heart pounded in her chest. She didn't want to do this, not like this, not for their amusement. But something inside her told her that maybe, just maybe, It was time they saw something real. As she reached the piano, she paused and looked at her reflection on its surface. Her apron looked plain against the polished wood. She sat down carefully, adjusting her posture like she used to when she was younger. Her fingers hovered above the keys. Someone whispered, "This is going to be good," followed by quiet laughter. Grace took a deep breath and closed her eyes. In that moment, the sound of the party faded away. She wasn't in the mansion anymore. She was back in her small home, sitting beside her mother, the window open, the smell of rain in the air. Her mother's voice whispered in her memory, "Don't let fear steal your song." Her fingers touched the keys. At first, she played a few soft notes, an unsure, delicate, like testing the water. The guests laughed quietly, but she didn't stop. The melody began to grow, turning into something smoother, deeper. Then the sound changed. It became music, real music, the kind that filled the room with warmth and feeling. The rhythm was calm but strong, flowing from her fingers like a river. Each note seemed to tell a story of loss, hope, and courage. The guests slowly stopped whispering. The laughter died down. Harold, who had been smirking a moment ago, leaned forward slightly. His expression softened. Grace kept playing, forgetting about the crowd. The piano sang under her hands. Her body relaxed, her shoulders swayed gently, her face peaceful. The music grew louder, full of life. It wasn't a perfect performance. There were small slips, moments where her fingers trembled. But every note came straight from her heart. When she finally stopped, the sound faded into silence. The guests stared at her, speechless. The room that had once been full of laughter now felt different, quieter, almost reverent. Grace looked up nervously, unsure what to do. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then someone at the table whispered, "That was beautiful." A few people nodded slowly. Others just looked down, embarrassed. Harold didn't say anything. His face was unreadable. Grace stood up, gave a polite smile, and said softly, "Excuse me, sir," before quietly walking back to the kitchen. As she disappeared down the hall, Harold finally let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. He glanced at the piano again, the reflection of the light gleaming on its surface. For the first time that evening, he had nothing clever to say. Back in the kitchen, Grace stood near the sink, her hands trembling slightly. The sound of her own heartbeat filled her ears. She wasn't angry, not even proud, just relieved. She didn't play to impress them. She played because she needed to remember who she really was. And somewhere deep down she knew that the moment wasn't over. Something had shifted in that room. Something Harold and his guests would not forget easily. As the night ended and the guests began to leave, whispers filled the hall. They didn't talk about the wine or the food anymore. They talked about her. The nanny who played like a professional, the woman they had laughed at, the one who had somehow made them feel small without saying a single word. Upstairs, the children who had woken up during the music were sitting on the staircase, smiling sleepily. "That was you, wasn't it?" the little boy said when Grace tucked him back in bed. She smiled and nodded. "Just a little tune," she whispered. He grinned. "You play better than anyone." Grace brushed his hair gently and said, "It's not about playing better, dear. It's about playing with your heart." As the house grew quiet, Grace stood by the window for a while, looking at the moonlight on the garden. The air felt lighter. Maybe life had taken her away from her dreams. But tonight reminded her that some things, like music and self-worth, never really disappear, and though she didn't know it yet, this night would change everything. Not just for her, but for the man who tried to mock her, and ended up discovering something far more valuable than pride or power. The next morning, the mansion felt unusually quiet. The party was over, but something about the night before lingered in the air. Grace walked through the halls with her cleaning basket, the sound of her shoes soft against the floor. The grand piano in the corner still shone under the morning light, and she could almost hear the faint echo of her music in her mind. The staff was whispering as she passed by. Normally they talked about errands and chores, but today they were talking about her. "I heard she played like a real artist," one of the cooks said while arranging the breakfast trays. "She really did," replied another. The guests were silent. Even the boss didn't know what to say. Grace smiled faintly but didn't stop to listen. She didn't play for praise or attention. She had played because her heart told her to. Still, she couldn't help but feel a little nervous. She wondered what Mr. Harold thought about it. Would he be angry? Embarrassed? Or maybe he would fire her for stealing attention at his fancy dinner. She went about her work as usual, keeping her head low. She dusted the shelves, folded the linens, and helped the children get ready for school. The children looked at her differently that morning, their eyes full of curiosity. "Can you play again?" the little girl asked shyly as Grace tied her hair. Grace smiled. "Maybe someday," she said softly. "When there's time," the girl grinned. "You're better than the teacher who comes here," she said proudly. "I told Daddy that." Grace laughed gently. "You shouldn't tease your teacher," she said. But her heart felt warm hearing the child's words. Later that day, after the children left for school, Grace sat alone in the kitchen during her short break. She had her small cup of tea and stared out the window. The sky was cloudy and the trees outside swayed in the wind. The silence gave her space to think, and her thoughts drifted back to the life she had before all this. Years ago, long before she worked in this mansion, Grace had dreams. She grew up in a small neighborhood where everyone knew everyone. Life wasn't easy, but there was love in every corner of her home. Her mother worked as a seamstress, and her father fixed old instruments at the church. Their house was filled with music. Even when they didn't have much food, there was always a melody in the air. When Grace was just a little girl, she discovered the piano at church. It was old with chipped keys and faded wood, but to her it was the most beautiful thing in the world. Every day after school, she would sneak into the church hall and play for hours. Sometimes the pastor would smile and listen quietly from the back. He once told her, "You play with more heart than most musicians I know." Her mother couldn't afford real lessons, so Grace taught herself. She listened to songs on the radio and tried to copy them on the keys. She learned by feeling, not by notes. Whenever she made mistakes, she laughed and started again. Music made her feel free, like she could rise above everything. Poverty, struggle, pain. When she grew older, people in the neighborhood started inviting her to play at weddings and small events. She would dress neatly, her hair tied back, and play her favorite tunes. People clapped, smiled, and sometimes even cried. They said her music carried stories. Grace never thought of herself as special. She just played because she loved to. But life had a way of changing everything. When her mother got sick, Grace stopped performing. The hospital bills kept piling up, and she spent her days working 2 jobs, cleaning houses and helping in a small diner. Music became a quiet memory, something she thought belonged to her past. After her mother passed, Grace tried to keep playing, but the pain in her heart made it hard. Every key reminded her of her mother's voice saying, "Don't ever let go of your gift." But she did. She sold the piano to pay rent. It broke her heart, but she had no choice. For months she didn't touch another instrument. The world became heavy and silent. Then, one day, she met an older woman who ran a community center. The woman needed someone to teach the local children some music. Grace hesitated. She hadn't played in years. But the woman smiled and said, "They don't need a perfect teacher. They just need someone who cares." Grace accepted. And that's how she found joy again. She taught the children to play simple tunes, clapping hands, laughing when they made mistakes. For a while it felt like life was good again. The sound of laughter and small fingers on piano keys gave her peace. But the center closed after losing funding, and Grace had to find another job. That's how she ended up working for Mr. Harold's family. She didn't plan to stay long, but the children liked her and she needed stability. So she stayed, taking care of them, cooking, cleaning, humming her quiet songs while sweeping floors. The nights were the hardest. When everyone slept, she sat near her small window, listening to the sound of the city. She missed the piano so much that it hurt. One day, she found a broken keyboard at a thrift shop for a few dollars. The keys were chipped and half of them didn't work, but it was enough for her. She cleaned it, fixed what she could, and placed it near her bed. Every night she played softly, not for anyone to hear, but just to feel alive again. And now, after all these years, she had played again, not on her old keyboard, but on that grand piano in front of people who never believed she could. The memory of last night felt unreal. It was as if something deep inside her had woken up. While Grace was lost in thought, the sound of footsteps made her look up. Mr. Harold stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. She quickly stood and wiped her hands on her apron. "Good morning, sir," she said quietly. He nodded slowly. Good morning. There was a long pause before he added, You play very well. Grace hesitated. Thank you, sir, she said softly. I didn't expect that, he said. You surprised everyone, she lowered her eyes. I'm sorry if I caused trouble. I didn't mean to, he interrupted, shaking his head slightly. No, it wasn't trouble, it was unexpected, that's all. There was another silence. He seemed to want to say more but didn't know how. Finally, he cleared his throat and said, The guests were talking about it all night. Grace simply nodded. I'm glad they enjoyed it. He gave a small nod and turned to leave but stopped at the door. How did you learn to play like that? She smiled faintly. I just listened, sir, and I practiced whenever I could. He looked at her for a moment almost as if he saw her differently for the first time. Well, he said quietly, you have a gift. Then he left. Grace stood there for a long while, her heart still beating fast. His words were simple, but to her they meant more than he could imagine. That evening, when the children came home, the house was filled with laughter again. The little girl ran to Grace holding a drawing of a piano she had made at school. Look, this is you playing, she said proudly. Grace knelt down, smiling warmly. That's beautiful, she said, her eyes soft. You're a little artist yourself. The girl giggled and hugged her. When the night came, Grace went to her small room and sat by her old keyboard. She placed her fingers on the few working keys and started to play a gentle tune. It wasn't perfect, but it filled the room with warmth. As she played, she thought about her mother, about the small church piano, about all the times life had pushed her down. But somehow she always found her way back to music. She didn't know what would come next. Maybe nothing would change. Maybe she would keep working quietly as she always did. But deep in her heart, she knew something was different now. People had hurt her, really hurt her. And perhaps, just perhaps, this was only the beginning of something she had long forgotten to dream about. That night, as the soft notes faded into silence, Grace closed her eyes and whispered to herself, maybe it's time to believe again. Outside her window, the wind blew gently through the trees, carrying her quiet melody into. The next few days went by quietly, but something in the air had changed. The big mansion didn't feel the same. The guests still came and went. The children still played, and the staff still worked as usual. But behind the usual rhythm, whispers of what had happened that night continued to spread. Grace didn't say much about it. She simply did her work with the same calm smile as before. But sometimes, when she walked through the hallway, she could feel eyes following her, not in mockery this time, but in quiet curiosity. Even the cook, who had always been short-tempered, seemed softer around her now. The piano in the corner remained untouched. Every time she passed it, she felt a strange pull, like the keys were quietly calling her back. But she didn't dare touch it again. She didn't want to give anyone a reason to say she was trying to show off. One evening, as the sun was setting, the golden light filled the hall through the tall windows. The air smelled faintly of roses from the garden. Grace was setting the dining table for another dinner. It wasn't as big as the last one, only a few important business guests this time. As she placed the plates, she heard Mr. Harold's voice in the background talking with his guests. His tone was confident, proud, the same as always. But when his eyes met hers for a moment, there was something different, something softer, less distant. The guests took their seats, laughing and sipping their drinks. One of them noticed the grand piano and smiled. You've got quite the instrument here, Harold, he said. Does anyone in the house play? Before Harold could answer, another guest added, Oh, you haven't heard? The nanny played at his last party. I wasn't there, but I heard people still talking about it. Grace froze where she stood. She wished she could disappear. Harold gave a small laugh, half embarrassed, half amused. Yes. That was unexpected, he said. Turns out she has quite a bit of talent. The guests laughed lightly, and one of them said, Then why not let her play again tonight? We could use some real music to end the evening. Grace looked up in surprise. Her heart raced. She didn't want to go through that again. Harold hesitated. For a brief moment he looked unsure, then turned to her. Grace, he said softly, would you mind playing something for us again? Her eyes widened. Sir, it's just for us, he said calmly. No pressure this time. The guests smiled politely, waiting. Grace looked down, her hands gripping the edge of the chair she was holding. "I don't think I should, sir," she said quietly. One of the men chuckled. "Come on, it's just a song. Don't be shy." Grace's chest tightened. It wasn't shyness, it was fear. Fear of being laughed at again, fear of being misunderstood. She could already feel the weight of their gazes. Harold noticed her hesitation. "It's all right," he said in a lighter tone. "Only if you feel comfortable." She wanted to say no. She wanted to finish setting the table and walk out quietly. But something inside her, something that had been silent for too long, stirred. Maybe she was tired of hiding what she loved. Maybe she was ready to show that her music wasn't a trick or an accident. She nodded slowly. "If you really wish, sir," she said softly. Harold gave a small smile. "Please," he said, gesturing toward the piano. The room quieted as she walked across the hall. Her shoes made soft sounds on the marble floor. The candles flickered gently. The air felt heavy, almost expectant. She sat down in front of the piano. Her reflection in the polished black surface looked calm, but her hands trembled slightly. She took a deep breath and placed her fingers on the keys. At first, she didn't play. She closed her eyes and listened to the silence around her. She remembered her mother's voice, the laughter of the children at the community center, the soft hum of her old keyboard. She remembered how the music always came from a place deeper than fear. And then she began to play. The first few notes were soft, almost like a whisper. Then the melody grew stronger, flowing smoothly, filling every corner of the hall. The sound was clear, beautiful, and full of emotion. It was a song she used to play when she missed her mother. Slow, gentle, full of memory. The guests stopped talking. Forks rested on plates. Glasses were put down quietly. One man leaned forward, his eyes wide. The melody changed, becoming more passionate, as if her soul was speaking through her hands. Each note carried something: pain, love, strength, and peace all mixed together. Her fingers moved with ease, like they had waited years for this moment. Harold sat still, his usual pride gone. For the first time, he wasn't thinking about business or reputation. He was simply listening. The music reached him in a way words never could. It reminded him of something he had forgotten: the simple beauty of human feeling. The song built slowly toward its peak, and Grace's hands moved faster, the melody bursting like sunlight after a storm. The sound wrapped around everyone in the room. No one spoke, no one laughed. They just listened. Then, as gently as it began, the song ended. The final note lingered in the air before fading into silence. For a few moments, nobody moved. It was as if the room itself was holding its breath. Then one of the guests whispered, "That was unbelievable." Another nodded, still staring at her. "I've been to concerts that didn't move me like that." Harold looked at Grace, his expression soft, humbled. He had invited her to play, to impress his guests, but instead, she had reminded them all of something money could never buy: sincerity, soul, and grace in its purest form. Grace looked up, her face calm but her eyes shining faintly. "Thank you," she said quietly before standing. The guests began to clap, not the loud, showy kind of applause, but slow, genuine appreciation. She bowed her head slightly and walked back toward the kitchen. As she passed Harold, he stood up. "Grace," he said gently, stopping her. "You played beautifully, truly." She smiled humbly. "Thank you, sir," she said, her voice soft but steady. When she disappeared into the hallway, the guests turned to Harold, still stunned. "Where did you find her?" one asked. "She's been working here for years," Harold said quietly. "Taking care of the children." The man shook his head. "Incredible. You have a treasure in this house, Harold." Harold didn't answer. He was thinking about how he had once mocked her, how he had treated her like she was invisible. He felt a heaviness in his chest that wasn't guilt alone, but something deeper: realization. After the dinner ended and the guests left, Harold walked back to the piano. The keys were still warm from her touch. He sat down, pressing one key gently, but the sound felt hollow. He realized it wasn't the piano that made the music. It was her heart behind it. Later that night, Grace sat in her small room, her fingers still tingling from the music. She didn't know what the future would bring, but she felt lighter, freer. For years, she had hidden her music behind fear and circumstance. But tonight, she remembered what her mother used to tell her. You can silence yourself, but not the song inside you. As she looked out the window, the stars shimmered faintly. She whispered to herself, maybe I was never meant to stop playing. And somewhere down the hall, Harold stood quietly by the piano, lost in thought. He realized that for the first time in a long while, he had been moved not by wealth or success, but by something pure, the courage of a woman who played from the heart. The night ended in silence, but not the empty kind. It was the kind of silence that follows something meaningful, something that changes people in quiet ways. Grace didn't know it yet, but that night was the start of a new chapter in her life, one where her music would no longer be a secret. And for Harold, it was the beginning of understanding that not all worth can be measured in money or power. Some things, like the music of a humble heart, are priceless. The next morning, the mansion was filled with quiet talk. The guests who had been there the night before kept sending messages to Mr. Harold, thanking him for the dinner. But every single message mentioned the same thing, the nanny's music. Some said they had never heard anything so moving. Others asked where she learned to play. Harold didn't quite know how to answer. He sat at the breakfast table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold, his mind somewhere else. Every time he closed his eyes, he could hear that melody again. The sound of her music had followed him through the night, soft and haunting, like an echo that wouldn't fade. He wasn't sure why it affected him so deeply. Maybe because he had built his life on power and reputation, and yet in a few minutes of music, a woman he barely noticed had made him feel something real, something he hadn't felt in years. Grace, on the other hand, started her day as she always did. She helped the children get dressed, packed their lunches, and smiled as they chattered about school. But deep down, she felt a quiet peace. The night before had reminded her who she really was. When the children left, she stood by the window for a moment, her eyes landing on the piano in the hall. Sunlight hit its polished surface, making it shine. She didn't dare touch it, but she felt thankful to have played again, thankful that her music had finally been heard, even just once. That afternoon, while she was folding laundry, Harold walked into the room. She straightened up quickly, surprised. "Good afternoon, sir," she said politely. He nodded, holding something in his hand. "Good afternoon, Grace," he said. "I wanted to talk to you." Grace grew a little nervous. She wasn't sure if he was pleased or bothered about what had happened. "Yes, sir?" He hesitated for a moment, as if choosing his words carefully. "I've been thinking about what you did last night," he said slowly. "The way you played, it was remarkable." She smiled gently but said nothing. He looked at her, his tone softening. "You know, when I first asked you to play, I thought it would be amusing, a little entertainment for the guests. But when you played, it wasn't entertainment. It was something else." Grace looked down, feeling her throat tighten slightly. "It was just a song, sir," she said. He shook his head. "No, it wasn't just a song. It made everyone stop talking. It made them listen." He paused, then added, "It made me listen." There was silence for a moment. Grace didn't quite know what to say. Then Harold continued, "I don't know your full story, and it's not my place to ask, but I'd like to hear you play again. Not for a party this time. Just for the family. My wife, the children, and myself. Would you be willing to?" Grace hesitated. I don't know, sir. I don't want to cause any trouble." "There's no trouble," he said quickly. "We'd be honored." She looked at him, unsure if he truly meant it, but something in his voice sounded sincere. So she nodded slightly. "All right, sir." The next evening, after dinner, the family gathered in the large hall. The children sat excitedly near the piano, whispering to each other. Mrs. Harold smiled kindly, though she still seemed surprised that her nanny could play so beautifully. Grace stood by the piano for a moment, feeling the familiar rush of nerves. She had played in front of strangers, but this felt different. The atmosphere wasn't mocking anymore. It was warm, expectant, genuine. She sat down, took a deep breath, and began to play. The tune she chose this time was softer than before. It wasn't full of pain or defiance. It was full of warmth and memory. Her fingers danced lightly over the keys, creating a melody that felt like sunlight breaking through clouds. The little girl closed her eyes, swaying to the rhythm. Mrs. Harold placed her hand over her heart, moved by the gentleness in every note. Even the servants, who had paused in their work, stood quietly in the doorway listening. Grace's music told a story without words, a story of kindness, patience, and love that came from the simple moments of life. It carried the feeling of mornings by the window, of children's laughter, of nights filled with quiet prayer. Harold sat still, watching her. He couldn't believe how deeply her music touched him. He had heard famous musicians play, but none of them had ever made him feel what he felt now. Each note seemed to peel away a layer of his pride, showing him something pure and honest underneath. When the final note faded, the room stayed silent for a long moment. Then the little boy clapped first, his small hands echoing in the room. The others joined in, smiling. Grace smiled shyly, looking down. "Thank you," she said softly. Mrs. Harold stood and walked over to her. "That was beautiful," she said warmly. "You have a gift, Grace." Grace's eyes filled with quiet gratitude. "It's just something I've loved since I was young," she said. The little girl tugged at Harold's sleeve. "Daddy, she should play for other people too," she said innocently. "Like on a big stage?" Harold smiled faintly, his eyes still on Grace. "Maybe she should," he said thoughtfully. Grace laughed softly. "Oh no, sir. That's not for me. I'm happy just playing here." But Harold's mind was already turning. He couldn't stop thinking about how her music could inspire others. There was a charity gala coming up in a few weeks, one that he was hosting for underprivileged children. For the first time, he thought about asking her to perform there. Later that night, when everyone had gone to bed, Harold stood alone in the hall again. The piano sat quietly, but he could still feel the echo of her music in the air. It was strange. He had walked past that piano hundreds of times without ever really hearing it. Now it felt alive. He sat down at the bench and pressed a single key. The sound rang softly. He smiled to himself, shaking his head. "She's extraordinary," he whispered. Upstairs, Grace was sitting by her window again, her small keyboard on her lap. She played a simple tune, one that matched the peace she felt inside. The stars shone faintly outside, and for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to dream. The following week, the atmosphere in the house remained calm but full of quiet excitement. The children asked her to teach them small tunes, and she happily showed them. Their laughter filled the house, and even the staff seemed more cheerful. One afternoon, as she was teaching the little girl a few notes, Harold walked in. He watched for a moment before saying, "You're a good teacher." Grace smiled. "Music is easier when you enjoy it," she said. He nodded slowly, then added, "There's something I wanted to ask you." She looked at him curiously. "Yes, sir?" He hesitated, then said, "There's a charity gala next week, an event to raise money for children who can't afford education. It's very important to me. I'd like you to play at the event." Her eyes widened. "Me? Sir, I couldn't—" "Please," he said gently. "You'd be doing something meaningful. Your music has the power to move people. I think it could make a difference." Grace shook her head nervously. "I've never played at something like that. I'm just a nanny." He smiled slightly. "No, you're not just anything. You're someone with a rare gift. You don't have to be famous to touch hearts." His words made her pause. She could see the sincerity in his eyes. After a moment, she nodded slowly. "All right, sir. If it helps the children, I'll do it." He smiled, relieved. "Thank you, Grace. You won't regret it." That night, she couldn't sleep. The thought of performing in front of so many people frightened her, but at the same time, she felt excited. Maybe this was her chance to bring back what she had lost. Not fame or recognition, but purpose. As the days passed, she practiced every night after finishing her work. The broken keyboard in her room became her closest friend again. She played until her fingers hurt, repeating melodies she once knew by heart. Sometimes the children would sneak in to listen, sitting quietly on the floor as she practiced. The night before the gala, Harold found her still playing softly. He stood by the door for a while before saying, "You're ready." She looked up and smiled nervously. "I hope so, sir," he nodded. "You have nothing to prove. Just play from your heart, like you always do." Grace looked at the keys, her heart full. "That's the only way I know how," she said. And when the next evening arrived, she stepped onto a stage for the first time in years. Not as a servant, not as a background figure, but as a musician. The hall was full of people dressed in luxury, but this time the laughter she heard wasn't cruel or mocking. It was warm. As she sat before the piano and placed her fingers on the keys, she took one deep breath and remembered where she came from. The little girl in the church, the daughter who never gave up. The woman who played for the world without bitterness in her heart. When she began to play, her music flowed like light, honest, human, and full of hope. And before long, the entire room fell silent, completely captured by the sound of her soul. The night of the charity gala glowed with gold light and the hum of quiet conversation. Expensive cars lined the driveway, and the grand hall sparkled with chandeliers and laughter. Men in suits and women in glittering gowns moved gracefully across the room, greeting each other with practiced smiles. For Harold, it was another important event, but this time, his heart wasn't on the business deals or the donations. His thoughts were fixed on the woman who sat quietly behind the stage, waiting for her turn. Grace sat on a small wooden chair, her hands resting on her lap. Her dress was simple, one that Mrs. Harold had insisted she borrow, a soft cream color that brought out the calm warmth in her eyes. She looked nervous, though she tried to hide it. Every sound from the hall made her heartbeat quicken. A young stage assistant came to tell her she'd be playing soon. She nodded and whispered, "Thank you." Back in the hall, Harold stood near the stage, pretending to listen to another businessman talk about investments. But his mind wandered. When the announcer finally walked up to the microphone, he straightened. "Ladies and gentlemen," the announcer said, smiling to the crowd, "tonight we have a very special performance. This performer may not be a celebrity, but her music speaks to the soul. Please welcome Miss Grace." A soft murmur spread through the crowd. Some people looked surprised, others curious. Harold saw a few faces he knew. People who had been at the dinner that night when he first asked her to play. Their expressions showed a mix of recognition and disbelief. Grace walked slowly toward the piano under the lights. She could feel hundreds of eyes on her, but she kept her gaze low. When she reached the piano, she paused, took a deep breath, and let her fingers rest gently on the keys. For a moment there was silence. Then she began to play. The music started softly, like a whisper carried by the wind. Her fingers moved with grace and emotion, and as the melody unfolded, the noise of the room vanished. Every note held a story, the sound of struggle, love, faith, and quiet hope. She played not for fame, not for applause, but for the children who needed help, for the hearts that had forgotten kindness, and maybe a little for herself. As she played, Harold felt something stir deep inside him. He had spent years chasing wealth, thinking success was the only thing that mattered. But now, as he listened, he realized how small those things felt compared to the honesty in her music. His wife stood beside him, tears glistening in her eyes. "She's incredible," she whispered. He nodded slowly, unable to speak. When the final note faded, the entire room stayed still for several seconds, caught in the spell she had woven. Then suddenly applause broke out, soft at first, then louder, rising until the whole hall echoed with it. Grace stood, her hands trembling slightly, her eyes shining with emotion. She bowed humbly, smiling with quiet gratitude. Harold stepped forward and joined in the applause, his expression softer than anyone had ever seen. When she turned to leave the stage, he met her halfway and extended his hand. "That was beautiful," he said quietly. "Thank you, sir," she replied, still catching her breath. "You did more than play music tonight," he said. "You touched every person here." She smiled gently. "I only played what I feel, sir," he nodded. "That's what makes it powerful." Later that evening, after the event ended, the guests mingled again. Many came up to Grace, offering kind words and praise. Some asked where she had trained, others if she had recordings. She answered each one politely, saying she had learned on her own. The genuine humility in her voice surprised everyone. Harold watched from a distance, thinking about how blind he had been before, how easily he had judged her without knowing her story. He felt ashamed remembering the night he had asked her to play only to make her a subject of laughter. When the guests began to leave, he found her sitting by herself near the stage, her hands folded together. He walked over slowly and said, "May I sit?" She looked up and nodded. "Of course, sir." He sat beside her, the air quiet between them for a moment. Then he said softly, "Grace, I owe you an apology." She looked surprised. "An apology?" "Yes," he said. "When I first asked you to play at the dinner, I wasn't kind. I thought it would be amusing. But you showed me something I didn't expect. I'm truly sorry for the way I treated you." Her eyes softened. "You don't have to say that, sir." "What's done is done," he shook his head. "No, I need to say it. Because I was wrong." Grace smiled faintly. "Maybe it happened for a reason. If you hadn't asked me, I might never have played again." He looked at her thoughtfully. "You really believe that?" "Yes," she said simply. "Sometimes the hardest moments push us toward the things we're meant to do." He nodded slowly, taking in her words. For a man who had built empires, her wisdom humbled him. After a moment, he said, "You belong on a stage, Grace, not just here, everywhere. People need to hear you." She laughed softly, shaking her head. "Oh, no, sir. I'm not meant for fame. I just like to play." "But you could change lives," he insisted gently. "You already changed mine." Her eyes glistened. "You've already done enough by letting me share my music tonight." He smiled and stood. "You're a remarkable woman." That night, as Grace walked home, she felt lighter than she had in years. The night air was cool and the city lights shimmered on the quiet streets. She thought about how far she had come. From the girl who played on an old keyboard to the woman who performed in a grand hall. When she reached her small apartment, she sat by the window and looked up at the stars. She didn't dream of wealth or recognition. She just felt thankful. Thankful that her music still had meaning, that it could bring peace to others. The next morning, when she returned to work, the house seemed different. The staff greeted her warmly, and even the children seemed extra proud. The little girl ran up and hugged her. "Everyone was talking about you, Grace," she said happily. "You were amazing." Grace laughed softly and hugged her back. "Thank you, sweetheart." Harold came downstairs soon after, looking more relaxed than usual. "Good morning, Grace," he said. "Good morning, sir." "I've been thinking," he said, "about what you said last night, about how the hardest moments lead us to the right path." She nodded, waiting for him to continue. "I want to help you," he said, "not as your employer, but as someone who believes in your gift. I know a few people in the Music Foundation who organize small concerts for talented artists. They help raise money for children's schools. I could talk to them." Grace looked surprised. "You'd do that for me?" "After what you've done for us, it's the least I can do," he said. She hesitated, touched by his kindness. "That means a lot, sir, truly, but even if it doesn't happen, I'm happy where I am." He smiled. "You have a good heart, Grace, but the world deserves to hear it too." Over the next few days, word of her performance spread quietly. A few guests who had attended the gala spoke about her online, calling her music breathtaking and pure. Some even sent donations to the children's charity in her honor. When Harold told her this, she was stunned. "I didn't expect that," she said softly. He chuckled. "Neither did I, you see? You're already making a difference." That night, after everyone went to sleep, Harold walked into the living room again. The piano stood quietly under the soft glow of the lamps. He sat down, pressing one key, then another. The sound reminded him of that first night, the night when pride blinded him. He smiled to himself and whispered, "Thank you, Grace," because in her music, he had found something he hadn't felt in years. Humility, peace, and a bit of humanity he thought he'd lost. Meanwhile, Grace stood by her own small window holding her old keyboard. She played a few notes, the same melody she had played at the gala. But this time she smiled while playing, not because of praise or applause, but because she finally understood her purpose. Music had always been her way of speaking. And now, it was her way of healing. As the notes filled her tiny room, she closed her eyes, letting the sound wrap around her like a warm memory. Somewhere in another part of the city, Harold sat alone at his piano, unknowingly playing the same melody. Two people, from two completely different worlds, connected not by money or status, but by the quiet truth of a song. And as the night went on, that shared melody lingered softly, a reminder that sometimes the most powerful change begins not with wealth or fame, but with simple kindness and the courage to listen. The weeks that followed the charity gala changed everything, though no one saw it coming that way. Grace returned to her daily work quietly, the same gentle smile on her face, the same care in her heart. To her, the music night had been a moment of gratitude, not a beginning of fame. But for Harold, it had opened something inside him, something that refused to close again. The sound of her piano lingered in his memory day after day. It wasn't just the beauty of her playing, it was what it did to him. It made him question things he had ignored for years. How he treated others, what really mattered, and how easily he had let pride guide his choices. One morning, he found himself standing by the piano again. He looked at the keys for a long time before pressing a few random notes. They sounded flat and lifeless. He smiled faintly. "It's not about the piano," he murmured. "It's about the person who plays it." He made a decision that day. Later that afternoon, when Grace finished helping the children with their lessons, he asked her to come to his office. She walked in quietly, wondering what it was about. He stood by the window holding a letter in his hand. "Grace," he said, turning to her, "do you remember when I mentioned that music foundation?" She nodded. "Yes, sir. They're hosting a special event next month," he said. "It's for young artists and musicians who come from humble beginnings. I spoke to them about you. They'd like you to perform, officially as a guest artist." Her eyes widened in shock. "Me, but I'm not a professional," he smiled. "You don't need to be. You have something most professionals forget, soul. That's what they want." She hesitated, her heart racing. "I don't know if I can do that." "I know you can," he said firmly. "You've already done it once. This time it's not just about you. It's for others like you, people who need to believe that their dreams are still alive." His words sank deep. She looked down, thinking. For so long, she had buried her gift under fear and survival. Maybe this was her chance to bring it back. Not for herself, but to inspire others who were lost in the same silence. Finally, she nodded slowly. "All right, sir. I'll do it," he smiled warmly. "Good. I'll make all the arrangements." As the days went by, the house buzzed with quiet anticipation. The children were the most excited. They'd sit by her side in the evenings as she practiced, humming along to her melodies. Even the staff, who once only saw her as the nanny, began to treat her differently, with admiration, even pride. But for Grace, it wasn't about recognition. It was about gratitude. Gratitude for being given another chance to play, to live through her music again. Every night she practiced after everyone went to bed. The melodies she played were new but felt old, as if they had lived inside her all along, waiting to be heard. Sometimes she'd pause, close her eyes, and whisper softly, "Thank you, Mama. You were right. Music never leaves you." When the day of the event finally arrived, the hall was packed again. Not with rich socialites this time, but with artists, families, and children from small schools. The foundation had decorated the place with simple lights and flowers. The air was filled with excitement and warmth, not pride. Grace sat backstage, her hands folded tightly. She could hear the distant chatter and laughter. But this time she didn't feel nervous. She felt calm. Harold came backstage before she went on. "You ready?" he asked. She looked up at him and smiled. "As ready as I'll ever be," he nodded. "No matter what happens, know that I'm proud of you. You've reminded me of something I forgot, and that kindness and talent can come from anywhere." She smiled softly. "Thank you, sir. You've done more than you know." When her name was called, the crowd applauded gently. She walked onto the stage, not dressed in fancy clothes, but in a simple blue dress. The piano sat waiting, shining under the lights. She took her seat, took a deep breath, and began to play. The tune she played was one she had written herself, a mix of hope and memory, sorrow and light. It began slowly, almost like a whisper, then grew richer and fuller. The sound filled every corner of the hall, wrapping around the people like a warm embrace. It wasn't just music. It was life poured into sound. It was the laughter of the children she cared for, the kindness of those who had believed in her, the pain she had carried, and the peace she had finally found. As she played, Harold watched from the front row, his eyes shining with quiet pride. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about business or success or image. He was just listening, truly listening. When she finished, the audience rose to their feet. The applause was loud but not shallow. It was genuine, full of feeling. Grace stood, bowed slightly, and smiled through tears. She looked out at the faces, young and old, rich and poor, all united by one thing, her music. After the event, people surrounded her with congratulations and praise, but she stayed humble, thanking each one softly. Harold stood nearby, smiling at her like a proud mentor. Later, when the hall had emptied and the lights had dimmed, Grace returned to the stage alone. She sat by the piano one last time, tracing the keys with her fingers. Harold joined her quietly. "It's strange," he said. "I've attended hundreds of concerts, but this one felt different," she smiled. "Maybe because it was real," he nodded. "You've reminded me that success isn't about how much you own, but how much you give. And sometimes giving means sharing what's inside your heart." Grace looked at him with kind eyes. "Everyone has something to give, sir. You gave me a chance. That's all I needed." He smiled, his voice soft. "I think you gave me more than that, Grace. You gave me back my humanity." They sat there in silence for a moment, listening to the faint hum of the piano strings. In the days that followed, life slowly returned to normal. Grace continued working for the family, helping the children and playing music whenever she could. But things weren't quite the same anymore. The world around her seemed brighter. Letters began arriving from schools, music teachers, and even strangers who had watched her performance online. They wrote about how her story inspired them to start again, how her music gave them hope. Grace read each one carefully, tears filling her eyes. One letter came from a small community center in the city. They asked if she would be willing to teach children piano lessons once a week. She smiled at the letter for a long time before whispering, "Yes." When she told Harold about it, he was overjoyed. "That's wonderful," he said. "You're becoming exactly who you were meant to be." She laughed softly. "Maybe. I just want to share what I've been given." From that point on, every Saturday morning she went to the center. The room was small, the pianos old, but the laughter of the children filled the air. She taught them gently, telling them that music didn't need money or fame, just heart. Sometimes Harold would visit quietly and watch from the back. He never interrupted. He just smiled, seeing how the same woman he once underestimated was now changing lives. One afternoon, after the lesson, Grace played a small tune for the children, the same song she had played the night of the gala. They clapped happily, their little faces glowing. When she looked up, she saw Harold standing at the door, clapping softly too. Their eyes met, and they both smiled, not as employer and nanny anymore, but as two souls who had learned something precious from one another. Years later, the same song would be played by one of her students at another charity event, and when asked where they learned it, the child would say proudly, "From Miss Grace. She said music can make hearts kind." And that's what she left behind. Not fame, not fortune, but kindness through music. Because in the end, the melody that once began in a mansion filled with judgment turned into a song that reached countless hearts, teaching them that everyone, no matter where they come from, carries something beautiful inside, and sometimes it only takes one person who's willing to listen, to turn that hidden song into something the whole world can hear.